WWE fans are in shock as Paul Heyman delivers a heart-wrenching message following Seth Rollins' devastating knee injury that has ruled him out of SummerSlam 2025. In this breaking WWE update, we cover everything you need to know about Seth Rollins' injury on Raw, Paul Heyman's emotional reaction, and what this means for the future of both superstars. Is this truly the end of an era? There's something cruel in how fast it all fell apart. One moment, Seth Rollins stood in the center of that ring, defiant, resilient, drenched in the glow of the spotlight that had never once dimmed since his meteoric rise through the ranks of WWE. And the next, he was down. Not just knocked to the mat, but broken. Literally. A single movement. A single twist. A knee bending the wrong way. And everything, his SummerSlam main event, his reign, his redemption story, was gone. Tonight, the WWE Universe is in stunned disbelief. And behind the curtain, the reaction was even worse. Because just minutes ago, Paul Heyman, one of the most strategic minds in WWE history and a man known for never showing emotion, was seen stepping away from the trainer's room, red-eyed, silent, and visibly shaken. Whispers began to spread. Not about angles or promos or heel turns, but about goodbyes, and not the kind that play out in storylines. This was something heavier. Something final. This was the man who once stood toe-to-toe with the Authority. Who carried Monday Night Raw on his back. Who bled, laughed, and roared his way into main events around the globe. And now, Seth Rollins' career may be dangling by threads stitched together by doctors, by hope, and by the prayers of fans who never thought they'd see this day come, because this wasn't just an injury. It was a fracture in more ways than one. A fracture in his body. A fracture in the plans for SummerSlam. And perhaps, a fracture in the future of his career. The diagnosis came fast. Too fast. The footage was reviewed. Seth's leg was twisted unnaturally, bent in a way no human joint should bend. Trainers knew. The doctors confirmed. Fractured ligaments. Damaged cartilage. A brutal knee injury that could sideline him for 9 months or longer, and with that, the script flipped. SummerSlam lost its architect, and Paul Heyman, normally the cold master of manipulation, was now just a man standing outside a trainer's room, forced to accept a future without the superstar he had quietly come to believe in. If you had asked Heyman 2 years ago whether Seth Rollins would be his guy, he may have laughed it off. Paul Heyman's career had always been shaped around giants and monsters: Brock Lesnar, Roman Reigns, CM Punk. Men with dangerous charisma and animalistic dominance. But Seth? Seth was a storm. Calculated chaos wrapped in designer jackets and sarcastic laughter. He wasn't just a wrestler. He was a movement. A man who danced at the edge of insanity while commanding crowds like a preacher in a cathedral of carnage. Heyman didn't choose Rollins. Rollins made himself undeniable, and over time, that uneasy alliance, built on strategy, ego, and mutual benefit, began to evolve into something deeper. Respect. It wasn't just that Seth Rollins was one of the best to ever do it. It was that he never stopped proving it, and yet now, all that brilliance is shrouded in uncertainty. When the news broke backstage, it wasn't dramatic. It was quiet. The kind of quiet that only happens when something real has occurred, something that can't be undone with rematches or creative rewrites. Doctors didn't need time. They saw the scans. They knew. Rollins was ruled out of SummerSlam immediately, and just like that, WWE's grandest stage lost one of its brightest stars. But the question no one wants to ask, the one Paul Heyman couldn't answer even if he tried, is whether Seth Rollins will ever be the same again. Knees don't lie. They don't forgive, and in a business where milliseconds decide legacies, even the smallest weakness can become a sentence. For Rollins, this isn't his first battle with injury. Longtime fans remember the heartbreak of 2015, when a torn ACL and MCL forced him to relinquish the WWE Championship at the height of his reign. He fought back then. Gritted through rehab. Returned stronger, but this time feels different, because this wasn't just an injury. This was a collision course that had been quietly building for months. Behind the dazzling performances and championship runs, Rollins had been nursing smaller injuries, nagging pains he ignored in the name of momentum. As SummerSlam approached, the pressure only intensified. Training doubled. cardio tripled. The burden of being the visionary was never light. And it may have cost him everything. For Paul Heyman, this moment is more than just professional disappointment. It's personal. The backstage cameras caught what the audience wasn't meant to see: Heyman with his hands over his mouth, staring blankly at a monitor, replaying the injury over and over. He didn't speak, not to talent, not to staff, not even to Triple H. Because when a man like Heyman is quiet, it doesn't mean he has nothing to say. It means he's choosing what to bury and who to let go of. Insiders claim Heyman spent nearly an hour by Rollins' side in the medical bay, silently listening as trainers outlined recovery times, surgical options, timelines that felt more like prison sentences than rehab schedules. And at the end of that hour, Heyman walked out alone. No swagger, no bravado, just loss. For all the theatrics of WWE, the real heartbreak often happens when the cameras stop rolling. When storylines crash into reality and the people who once felt invincible are left with ice packs, slings, and shattered expectations. Paul Heyman knew what this meant, not just for SummerSlam, but for the legacy they were building together, because in the world Heyman envisioned, Seth Rollins was on track for something bigger than belts. He was becoming the centerpiece of a new era, an era built on craft, danger, and unpredictability. And now, that era has no architect. As Seth Rollins faces months of surgery and slow healing, the rest of WWE continues to move forward. That's the nature of the business. The show doesn't pause. Opportunities don't wait. Title pictures evolve without warning. And in a heartbeat, yesterday's main event becomes tomorrow's memory. But for Paul Heyman, who has seen legends rise and fall, the ache cuts deeper, because what if this really is it? What if that was the last time we'll see Seth Rollins perform at that level? What if this injury doesn't just alter a card, but rewrites the history of a man who was supposed to be untouchable? There's something about Heyman that betrays the truth, even when he says nothing. When asked for a comment, he didn't cut a promo. He didn't shift blame. He just looked away and said, almost too softly, this wasn't supposed to happen again. Not like this, not now. Sources say the next few weeks will determine everything. Whether surgery can restore the knee's integrity, whether rehab can bring back explosiveness, whether Seth Rollins, the high-flying revolutionary, will ever fly again. But amidst all that uncertainty, there's one painful certainty: Seth Rollins is out of SummerSlam. And for WWE, for Heyman, and for fans who followed his journey from the Shield to the highest peaks of the industry, that loss is incalculable. Because Rollins wasn't just another superstar. He was a symbol of evolution, a living contradiction, chaotic, composed, arrogant, yet deeply human. A man who made fans feel something, even when they didn't understand why. And now, as Heyman prepares to adjust, to recalibrate, to possibly say goodbye, not just for now, but maybe forever, the question hangs heavy in the air: what happens when the visionary can no longer see the ring beneath his feet? When the roar of the crowd is replaced by the echo of crutches in a quiet hallway, when the fight becomes not one against an opponent, but against time, doubt, and biology itself. Heyman may move on. WWE always does, but tonight, something sacred feels broken, and goodbye feels much closer than anyone is ready to admit. He had been here before. The sterile scent of the trainer's room, the sharp sting of diagnosis, the clench of a jaw trying not to break in front of his peers. But something about this time felt colder, heavier, like the walls had grown taller and the hallway longer. Seth Rollins had faced injuries in the past. He had limped through pain and fought through silence. But even he knew, deep down, this wasn't just another setback. This was something darker. The first time he tore his knee, he was at the peak of his power. The architect, the champion, the face of the future. He had been flying high when it all came crashing down in 2015. That ACL tear had sent him spiraling into surgery, months of rehab, and the bitter taste of relinquishing a title he had fought tooth and nail to earn. And yet, he came back. He returned stronger, faster, more resilient. That's who Seth was. Not just a superstar, but a symbol of grit. Every scar was a badge. Every limp a reminder that greatness required pain. But time isn't fair. The body doesn't forget. And this latest fracture, the torn ligament, the cartilage damage, wasn't happening to a 28-year-old kid with fire in his lungs. This was a 38-year-old warrior whose body had absorbed every super kick, buckle bomb, and frog splash for over a decade. This wasn't just about healing. This was about survival. About legacy. About whether the vision could outlast the wear and tear of reality backstage. The locker room was quieter than usual. It wasn't the normal pre-SummerSlam energy. Something was missing. A pulse. A presence. Seth Rollins wasn't just a leader in the ring, he was the emotional undercurrent of Monday Night Raw. He carried the show when no one else could. He stepped up during the pandemic, delivered classics in empty arenas, made believers out of skeptics, and reminded the world that charisma wasn't just about words, it was about fire. And yet now, that fire was flickering. Paul Heyman, pacing near gorilla position, refused to look at anyone for more than a second. His coat was wrinkled. His eyes bloodshot. The illusion of control he always wore like armor was gone. This wasn't the advocate of champions. This was a man grappling with a reality he never wanted to face. He had watched Brock Lesnar walk away. He had seen Roman Reigns take a sabbatical. But those were exits with warning. With negotiations. With leverage. Seth Rollins was taken. Just like that, Heyman had placed his final bet on him. The visionary. The man who could carry the future while bridging the past. Together, they were building something, a new dynasty, free from the tribal wars and old guard politics. Seth wasn't just supposed to lead SummerSlam. He was supposed to rewrite what main events looked like. And now, with one grotesque pop of a knee, it was all on hold. Maybe permanently. In the days that followed the injury, the silence became deafening. WWE's official channels issued a carefully worded statement. Seth Rollins has suffered a significant injury and will be sidelined indefinitely. But inside the company, the conversations were far less optimistic. Medical insiders confided in staff that this particular combination of ligament tears and cartilage degradation was one of the most severe cases they had ever seen in WWE history. The best case scenario? 9 months. The worst? Retirement. Paul Heyman wasn't answering calls from creative. He wasn't talking to Triple H. When asked about replacement options for SummerSlam, he gave no opinion. Because in his mind, there was no replacement. Not for Seth. Not for a man who had clawed his way from NXT's first class to becoming the standard bearer of an entire generation. Rollins wasn't part of the machine. He was the engine. There were quiet talks of canceling the planned SummerSlam program altogether. The promo packages had already been cut. The graphics rendered. The main event teased for weeks. And yet, without Seth, none of it made sense. Not the pacing. Not the payoff. Not the psychology. There were whispers about pivoting to another superstar. Cody Rhodes. Drew McIntyre. Even a surprise Roman Reigns return. But every idea felt like patchwork. Like trying to paint over a masterpiece that had been ripped in half. Meanwhile, Rollins was recovering at home. Away from the ring. Away from the lights. Surrounded by ice packs, swelling, and the slow drip of time. The man who had once sprinted across barricades, stomped heads into the mat, and screamed his lungs out in front of sold-out arenas was now lying in silence. Watching from a hospital bed as the world moved on without him. And in the stillness of that room, it hit him, this might be it, not because he didn't believe in recovery. Seth Rollins believed in fighting. In defying odds. But there's a moment in every great wrestler's life where the war isn't against opponents anymore. It's against time. Against limitations. Against the voice in the back of your mind whispering, what if you can't do this anymore? And that voice was getting louder. For Heyman, the emotional weight was unique. He had watched many men fall. But Seth wasn't just a client. He was a kindred spirit. Both were storytellers. Both saw wrestling not as a sport, but as art. They built arcs, layers, depth. This wasn't about promos and pop. This was about psychology. About soul. And now the soul of the product was gone. There were meetings, closed-door sessions between creative, medical staff, and corporate. They discussed how to proceed. How to handle PR. How to acknowledge Seth's injury without creating panic. But even the most seasoned voices couldn't find the right spin. Because the truth was too raw, one of WWE's greatest modern performers was broken. Not in kayfabe. Not in storyline. But in real, irreversible ways, and Paul Heyman, who had once promised Roman Reigns immortality and Brock Lesnar dominance, had no speech prepared. No promo. No salvation. He had only silence. Fans began posting tributes online. Hashtags like #ThankYouSeth and #RollinsForever trended globally. Memes of his greatest moments. Clips of his Shield debut, his Money in the Bank cash-in, his curb stomps, his laughs, his tears. Everyone was remembering him in real time. Not because he was gone, but because they feared he might never come back the same, and Rollins saw it all. From a distance. Watching it unfold like a funeral he wasn't invited to. Still alive. Still breathing. But being eulogized just the same. Inside his house, Becky Lynch stayed strong. The man, now caretaker. Her strength, always on display in the ring, now focused entirely on being the anchor Seth couldn't be for himself. Their son, still too young to understand the gravity of what was happening, brought laughter to rooms otherwise filled with dread. But even Becky knew the truth. This wasn't just physical. This was emotional devastation. She knew how much he needed the ring. Not just to perform, but to feel alive. For Rollins, wrestling wasn't a job. It was blood. It was purpose. It was the only place he ever felt completely understood. And now that place was inaccessible. His body couldn't carry him there. His mind was trapped in questions. His future blurred. Paul Heyman visited once. Just once. He didn't stay long. The conversation was brief. But the moment lingered. They sat in the quiet of a living room lit only by soft daylight. No suits. No cameras, just two men bound by the unspoken weight of legacy, and as Heyman stood to leave, he turned back once. "You're still the visionary," he said. "Even if the vision changes." Then he was gone, and Seth, left alone, finally allowed himself to cry. The days rolled by slowly, marked not by matches or promos, but by the sterile rhythm of rehab appointments, bandaged knees, and whispered conversations. While Monday Night Raw pressed forward, titles defended, new contenders emerging, crowd chants echoing through arenas, Seth Rollins remained frozen in place. Each morning he opened his eyes to the same ceiling. Each night he wondered if the roar of the crowd he once lived for would ever echo for him again. But beyond the arena lights, beyond the buzz of wrestling forums and fantasy booking, a deeper storm was forming. It wasn't about titles or comebacks. It was about the one thing no athlete wants to admit. Finality. Sources close to Rollins began to speak in quieter tones. One described his current state as emotionally withdrawn, reflective, and, at times, resigned. Not to quitting, but to accepting the possibility that his days of wrestling the way he wanted to wrestle, without fear, without restriction, might be numbered. Another insider revealed something far more painful, that Rollins had begun asking questions. Not about timelines. But about exit strategies. About how legends walk away when they've given everything. Paul Heyman, meanwhile, had reappeared in Stamford, not as the advocate, not as the puppet master, but as a man reluctantly rewriting a future he had carefully sculpted behind the scenes. For all of Heyman's bravado, his genius lay in patience. In building stars not just for moments but for eras. With Seth Rollins, he wasn't just trying to craft a championship reign. He was molding a legacy, one that could rival Cena's work ethic, Punk's voice, and Roman's dominance. But now, that legacy had a crack running through its center. Triple H, now more deeply involved than ever in creative and talent relations, convened a private meeting. No agents. No assistants. Just him, Heyman, and one painful topic: What if Seth Rollins doesn't return? Not hypothetically. Not as a passing concern. But as a real, looming outcome. The silence between them reportedly lasted several minutes. Because how do you replace a heartbeat? They talked about contingency plans. Who could step into the SummerSlam spotlight? Who could inherit the stories, the rivalries, the emotional weight? But each name fell flat. Cody Rhodes? Too focused on his American Nightmare arc. Drew McIntyre? Powerful, but not as narratively embedded. Gunther? A dominant force, yes, but still being shaped for the future. No matter how they twisted the puzzle pieces, the center was missing. And everyone in that room knew it. Backstage morale suffered, too. Wrestlers are used to injuries. They're part of the business. But this one felt different. Seth wasn't just a performer. He was the locker room's unspoken captain. The guy who gave advice freely, who helped call matches no matter how exhausted he was, who led by sheer presence. Without him, there was a vacuum. And with Roman Reigns still absent, there was no one to balance that energy. Even his rivals felt the shift. Damian Priest, set to feud with Rollins post-SummerSlam, was reportedly shaken. Their chemistry had been electric in dark matches, their promos fiery, their build-up poetic. Now, it was all in limbo. No payoff. No catharsis. Just scripts rewritten with bold red lines through the word Seth. Becky Lynch, always the lioness, continued to present strength in public. She wrestled through it. Smiled during interviews. But insiders say her backstage demeanor had changed. She was more serious, more isolated. She'd often leave early from events, not to avoid the spotlight, but to return to a home where a man was trying to rediscover himself in the quiet hum of painkillers and physical therapy. To return to the silence left behind when the crowd's roar is replaced by the steady beep of a motion therapy machine. And Seth? He wasn't watching the weekly shows anymore. Not every episode. Not live, at least. Sometimes he'd catch the highlights, scroll through social media. But most nights, he sat outside on the porch, a blanket over his lap, staring at nothing. Not because he had no interest. But because watching a world you used to own move on without you, it breaks something deep inside. There's a story, one that hasn't made headlines yet. One whispered among a few close friends and producers. During a recent call with a WWE physician, Seth reportedly asked a haunting question. If it doesn't heal right, could I still walk normally when I'm older? That wasn't a wrestler talking. That was a father. A husband. A man staring at a future where the ring might no longer be part of the picture, and wondering if chasing dreams had cost him normalcy. And that's the reality most fans never see, not the gear. Not the promos. But the human cost of greatness, because while Seth Rollins might be the visionary in the ring, outside of it, he's a man with tendons that don't heal like they used to. With a child who still wants to run in the backyard. With a wife who knows that under every stomp and every show-stealing match, there's a man who still feels pain, even if he's trained to hide it. Heyman, for his part, remains involved, but from a distance. He hasn't been at Raw tapings for the past few weeks. Insiders claim he's working on something else. What that is, no one seems to know. Some speculate he's crafting the rise of a new superstar. Others believe he's writing a final tribute, something that could air if Seth officially steps away. A video package. A documentary. A farewell tour in words and memories, not matches, because Heyman, more than anyone, understands what's at stake. He's seen men like this before. Men who burn bright, leave scorch marks across the canvas, and then disappear too soon, either because their bodies gave out or because the system never gave them the recovery they deserved. But Seth Rollins wasn't supposed to be that. He was supposed to be the bridge. The link between the Shield era and what comes next. A man who aged with grace, who passed torches with honor. Not this, not silence, not goodbye whispered through hospital walls. Back in Stamford, there's been talk, tentative, unsure, about what a retirement angle might look like. No one wants to admit it publicly. Not yet. But contingency plans are being drafted. What if Seth chooses to announce it himself? What if he wants to go out on his terms, in his voice, not theirs? And what if, just maybe, Paul Heyman is the only one he'd allow to tell that story, because while Triple H may be the architect of today's WWE, it's Heyman who still knows how to build legacies in ink and myth. The camera fades in on a memory, Rollins cashing in at WrestleMania 31. The crowd screaming. Heyman watching from backstage, not yet aligned, not yet tethered. Just watching. Seeing the future arrive before it even knew what it was. That's the story Heyman may one day have to tell, and maybe, just maybe, that story is already being written, because whether Seth Rollins comes back or not, whether the knee heals or doesn't, whether the crowd gets one more match or only one final wave, his impact has already been carved into the bones of the company. But for now, all that remains is waiting for a call from the doctor, waiting for strength to return to muscle, waiting for one more roar, and maybe, waiting for the words that Paul Heyman never wanted to say goodbye. They say the mark of a legend isn't how loud the crowd roared when you entered the arena, it's the silence that follows when you're gone. That hush, that pause, that aching gap in energy that no pyrotechnics or theme song can fill. And now, as WWE begins to accept the possibility of a future without Seth Rollins in the ring, that silence is starting to settle in. Quietly. Painfully. Permanently, the company has begun preparing behind the scenes. Not just for the absence, but for the memory. For the tribute. For the legacy. Somewhere in a dimly lit studio, voiceovers are being recorded. Archive footage is being pulled from dusty servers. A 23-year-old Tyler Black tearing up independent circuits in Ring of Honor, a younger Seth debuting in NXT with fire in his eyes, the iconic entrance through the crowd with Roman Reigns and Dean Ambrose as the Shield. A visual catalog of a man who went from the indie kid with potential to one of the most decorated and respected performers of the last 2 decades, and behind much of this, in a room he prefers to keep locked to everyone else, is Paul Heyman. He hasn't confirmed it. He won't admit to it. But according to those closest to production, Heyman is the one scripting the narrative. Not for a return, but for a goodbye. It's not just a video package. It's a eulogy written in motion. A story told in edits, echoes, and emotions. Heyman has always believed that wrestling is theater. That each career is an arc. And in Seth Rollins, he sees the rarest kind of arc, one that went full circle. From chaos to order, from selfishness to sacrifice. A man who began as a traitor and ended as a king. The script starts not with a victory, but with a fall. It opens with the moment Seth buckled, knee twisted, agony painted across his face. Then it moves backward. Not forward. Because this is not a celebration of strength. It is a meditation on fragility. On the cost of greatness. On the slow erosion of a body built to entertain but doomed to shatter. Heyman's vision is specific, no narration. Just Rollins' voice from interviews past. Words pulled from old pressers, podcasts, vignettes. The visionary, narrating his own rise, and possibly, his own final act. There's a moment, Heyman insists they include, from an old WWE 24 documentary. Seth is sitting on the locker room floor, lacing his boots, whispering to himself, "This is all I've ever wanted to do. And I'll keep doing it until I can't anymore." Now, the question is whether that day has come. Inside the Performance Center, younger talent walks the halls with a strange reverence.